Turn the lights. Don Wick is back there. Whitney Bittman's running around here someplace, and we'll see Jay Rader running around as well. I want to introduce a guest of ours that we've had on the air numerous times. First time I ever saw his face was yesterday. And you'll recognize the voice once he starts talking with us. And he's working with at USDA, been there for several years, and is one of the developers of the Drought Monitor system. So we're going to talk about that as well. Give Brad Rippey a nice round of applause. Brad, let's talk about your history a little bit first while we get started.
I'll take it back to, if you don't mind, I'm going to take it back to my childhood because my grandparents were farmers. Had a 40-acre farm in southern West Virginia, postage stamp-sized farm. And they did not grow traditional crops like what you see around here, specialty crop farm. They were kind of pioneers of this farm-to-table movement. Spoken for before it was ever grown. They delivered it to restaurants and merchants in the town of Lewisburg, West Virginia. So when I was young, anytime we visited the farm, we got put to work usually harvesting something, green beans, snap peas, or if fruits were in season, that's better. I remember many a time going up in a cherry tree with a milk pail, picking cherries that were destined for market. So that was a little bit of my background, and really the only farming I had in my background. By the time I got to college, that was a distant memory, really. And I was trained, I was speaking to a farmer out here who talking about just his love for the weather, and that's how I grew up, just loving the changes, the day-to-day, the seasonal changes in the weather, just watching everything happen. So I was trained as a forecaster. I went to Penn State, and I started out my career with the Department of Commerce and the National Weather Service, which is where a lot of meteorologists end up. But after a while, I felt the pull back to agriculture. So in 1998, I came over to USDA, and I started working for the Joint Agricultural Weather Facility. And that is an outfit that's still in existence today. Our flagship publication is the Weekly Weather and Crop Bulletin. It's kind of a companion, if you will, to the WASDE report, the Supply and Demand report, and some of the other publications that come out of USDA. We focus more on the weather side of things with a little bit of a hint of agriculture. We don't have any, numbers or anything like that, like the WASDE has, or crop production. And then about the time I joined USDA in 1998, I did become involved in the U.S. Drought Monitor. So that's been a big part of my career too. I was one of the 6 original authors of the Drought Monitor, and I'm still on the rotation. We have 10 rotating authors putting together the Drought Monitor. So happy to answer any Drought Monitor questions, but that's not really what we're here to talk about today. So that's how I got to where I am now. And I should mention that we had one guy in our office leave for a job in Switzerland back in 2001. And that's when I started picking up some of the radio responsibilities. Now, for any given week, I do at least 2 tapings with USDA Radio and a number of tapings with other media outlets, folks like you, where people just call me on the phone for interviews. So I've just kind of worked my way into the radio business, I guess you could say, at least on this end of the microphone over the last 2 decades.
I think that's part of just being a meteorologist, and you're highly specialized. When we first talked, we talked about the difference between what a television meteorologist or a regular radio meteorologist does and what you do at USDA, and there is a difference.
There's a big difference. Most people, when I say I'm a meteorologist, they'll ask me, what channel are you on? Where are you? I'm like, no, I don't do that. So it is highly specialized. A lot of the work I do, obviously, with the Drought Monitor and the Weekly Weather and Crop Bulletin is behind the scenes, but there is that media component. And so a lot of the stories that get produced by USDA Radio end up out there for free for, outfits like you to pick up. And then, of course, I have the direct contacts as well, too. So it's a little bit unique. It's not a big part. It's maybe 20% of my responsibility is some of the media work that I do. But it's good to do the outreach. I really enjoy doing it. And I love talking to the producers in particular and getting to know some of the folks that are actually doing the work that I'm reporting on. So, yeah, that's a big part of it.
Is big as the country is, meteorologists focus on weather all over the place anyway. Was it a change for you then to specialize just in the weather that impacts agriculture?
It really was. I mean, as I said, I was trained as a forecaster for really a specific area. And now all of a sudden I'm covering the entire United States. We actually have 5 meteorologists in our office, in the office of the chief economist. The other 4 cover other major agricultural regions. So we have people covering South American production or South Africa, for Australia, for Europe, for Asia, for South Asia. We've got it all covered. I just happen to be the U.S. analyst, so it comes to me any U.S. questions, whether it's North Dakota or Hawaii or anywhere in between. You know, that's what I'm focused on is U.S. weather and agriculture.
These wildfires, we started getting into some of the weather that we've had here this year. The wildfires that we saw out west, we saw smoke through the Midwest. Is that common?
It's very interesting because over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot of western U.S. wildfires. And at times, that smoke has worked its way into the Midwest and the Northern Plains. This year, almost all the smoke has been coming from northern Canada, which is highly unusual. I'll throw out a couple of numbers. So far this year in Canada, 40 million acres of mostly northern boreal forest has burned in Canada this year. The previous record for Canada, at least in modern times, was about 1/3 of that, something like 14 to 15 million acres. That was in 1995. So what we're seeing this year unfold in Canada, we've never experienced anything like this before in our lifetimes. And so anytime, you think of smoke coming when it's hot and dry, a lot of the smoke this year has come when it's been like that northwesterly flow, actually fairly cool, bringing that smoke down from British Columbia and Alberta and some of the northern provinces and territories of Canada. So really unique and unusual situation this year. That 40 million acres that's burned in Canada this year, to put it in perspective, the US record for acreage burned in a single year is 10 million acres. So they burned 4 times what we have ever seen US-wide in a single year. Truly historic and unusual.
Does that impact our crops?
Yes, that's the short answer. The longer answer is that crops, just like humans or animals, do not like pollutants. So anytime you can smell or taste the smoke, that's not good for anybody or anything. But then on the aspect of the filtration of the sun, if the smoke gets too thick to the point where it's kind of hazy or foggy looking, that can be an impediment to crop development. But if you have more diffuse smoke, especially in the upper atmosphere, that can actually be a positive. It allows the sunlight to be filtered a little bit more, that it gets deeper into the crop canopy, so it can actually help a little bit. So it's not really well understood. It's an ongoing research project at a number of universities looking at this to balance the negatives and the positives.
If you're a weather geek like I am, just to watch the weather maps, and the smoke was a good tracer to show the low pressure systems, high pressure systems this year.
Yeah, if you look at the satellite imagery, a lot of times you can see the low pressure areas spinning. But where you have high pressure, you don't have a lot of cloud tracers. But you're right, this year you could see all the loops and curls of the atmosphere being traced by the smoke, almost like a jet stream, when the planes fly by and you can see them. It's almost a tracer in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see that kind of thing. You don't normally get a chance to see that.
Yeah.
As far as this fall, then, with the smoke that we've had, the heat that we've had this summer, the drought impact on the crops, are we looking at the possibility of early frost because it's been so dry?
The answer is no. And it's really just prevailing weather patterns at this time. I looked at a couple of numbers on frost here, if I can find it in my notes. And I've got it here, I swear, Randy, I'll find it. But so in case you're wondering, the last time that we actually had a September freeze here in Fargo, that was 2020. So it's been 3 years since we had a September freeze. Looking at weather patterns out through the remainder of September, I think it's unlikely that there will be a freeze here in Fargo proper, at least at the airport location, for the rest of September. So, it used to be very rare. It used to be we had earlier frost. I looked up a couple of numbers here. The last time there were more than 2 September freezes in Fargo was 2012. That was a year that it didn't matter that there were freezes in September because everything was pushed along by drought. And the all-time record for September freezes in Fargo is 7, in case you're wondering. It's only happened once since the beginning of the 20th century, 1942. The other 2 years, 1886, 1893, totally different climate regime at that time. So again, looking ahead, we're going to be very warm and dry for the next week. In fact, I think it'll be above 80 degrees at least one day early next week, maybe a couple of days early next week. And then beyond that, this is going to be, it's from today notwithstanding, with a few rain showers, it's going to be the nicest stretch of weather you can imagine for this time of year. Great for crop dry down, great for field work. And then sometime around, I think the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, somewhere around there, we're going to see a pattern change. It's not going to cool down, but there's a big dip in the atmosphere, a big trough coming into the western United States. That is going to start pushing some rain in here. We're going to see a very autumn-like pattern developing, Pacific storms moving in. And I think there's a chance that, at least from a drought perspective, we could see some significant relief in here during the last 7 or 8 days of September.
Great, just in time for beet harvest.
So, unfortunately, if you could just shift these windows of dryness and wetness, it would be ideal. I don't think anybody's going to complain about the drought relief, especially in the northern half of the state, but timing may not be good for some of the harvest activities in the field work.
And that's typically what happens. October, then, are we looking a little wetter than normal?
At least early on, I think so, especially when we start talking about blocking patterns. This has nothing to do with El Nino. We'll talk about that later. We're just setting up a pattern that could stick for a few weeks where we've got a western trough, and then that's going to bring a lot of that southerly flow in through here, and then we've got the storms coming in. I know I start moving my hands when I start talking weather systems here. But yeah, so we're definitely setting up for a mild, wet end of September, probably into early October. At some point, though, we will see the impacts of El Nino start to kick in. When that happens, probably when this block that's setting up now breaks down, we will probably transition into a mild, dry rest of the autumn.
Well, El Nino typically for us, for our winters, is mild dry too, isn't it?
That is correct. So it's going to be, again, it's all in timing in terms of field work, but from a drought relief perspective, as of the drought monitor last week, I didn't get a chance to look at this morning's numbers, but we've got about 1/3, 34% of North Dakota is in drought.
Yeah.
And it's kind of flipped from what you would normally expect. We have no drought south or west of the Missouri River at this point, none whatsoever. So it's all focused in the north and the east at this time.
Yeah, and we've been verifying that with people we've talked with. You call the people out in that Dickinson area, and they go, "That's the best wheat crop we've ever had." Of course, they've gotten the rains that we haven't had on the eastern side of the state, so that makes definite sense.
Yeah, a little upside down on that. It's worse in Minnesota as of last week's drought monitor. I don't think it changed a whole lot this week. 85% of Minnesota is in drought. Of course, a lot of that's in the eastern and southeastern part of the state, not so much in the immediate area here. But they've also got 16% of Minnesota in extreme to exceptional drought, which is unusual, and that may be higher than what they had in 2012 because a lot of the drought was further south that year.
And that's what's impacting Mississippi River levels, right?
Yeah, so for the second year in a row, we've got Mississippi River levels down, and that could continue to be a problem. It's going to take, even if it does start raining, it's going to take a while for that moisture to work its way down. Hopefully it won't get as bad as last year, but by the time we get into October, unless we see wide-scale rains in some of the key watershed areas, it's going to take a while to bounce back from that. We could see some weight restrictions. I know we were talking about that. Some of the folks were talking about that yesterday in the market report. And we could see levels very close to what we saw in 2022 and rivaling those that we saw in 2012.
And not only that, but it's moving the product back north, the fertilizers.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. Just to remember that about 60% of that lower Mississippi drainage comes out of the Ohio River. So that's really important what happens in that part of the basin. And about 40% would be from the upper Mississippi and the Missouri. So that's kind of the ratio on how that river works.
How far east does that dryness go? Does you know western Ohio, eastern Ohio?
Interestingly, it doesn't. There's really not a whole lot of drought in the eastern part of the Corn Belt right now, but I think all the moisture this summer has gone into crops, and there's just not a whole lot of runoff at this time. They've just been getting by.
I think the biggest thing that we were talking about this a bit ago as well, the snow that we had last year came early enough where we didn't get a hard freeze, ground freeze. So a lot of that moisture went down, so that probably our saving grace for this end of the state.
There's no question about it. It was a really unique year. The snow came in early November in a lot of areas, stayed on the ground until, the end of April, even maybe around the 1st of May. And with that early snow, very little frost depth. So it did manage to percolate down. If that had not happened, if the frost had been in early and that had just set on top, it would have been probably a much worse disaster for northern and eastern North Dakota in terms of drought.
Rains have been so spotty. Talk a little bit about those ridge riding storms, how they impact just small little areas.
Yeah, so if you look at the way the rainfall patterns have played out the last few months, all the moisture that's come up from the monsoon, from the southwest, including the remnants of Hurricane Hillary, seem like they've wrapped pretty much into Wyoming, has been kind of ground zero for the wettest weather. Some of that has made it up into South Dakota, southwestern North Dakota, but it has not been able to push much further north than that. We've been dealing with this Canadian ridge for most of the spring and summer, and that's been sort of a culprit behind the wildfire activity. And it just has not really broken down at any significant point this summer, and that is not allowing that moisture to ride northward or eastward into that ridge of high pressure.
And at the same time, we've got that huge ridge down in Texas.
Yeah, that's a totally separate feature. So you kind of picture that there's one big bubble of high pressure over Canada, and this massive ridge that probably is related to El Nino that's been parked over Central America, Mexico, and southern United States. So ever since mid-June when that set up, we have been locked into this brutally hot, dry pattern, really stretching across the entire southern tier of the country, and especially from Texas to Florida. We've seen summer temperatures like we've never seen before, record summer heat all the way across that southern tier, again, Texas to Florida being the ground zero for that.
We always talk a lot about the Atlantic hurricanes, but there's also been some in the Pacific this year.
I just mentioned Hurricane Hillary, which was the first tropical cyclone to have an inland position over California since 1939, long time ago, 84 years ago. Very unusual to see a tropical system over the Pacific make it that far north. We've had other systems that have also provided moisture, so pretty active monsoon in parts of the West, especially the Great Basin, into Southern California, and then as I mentioned, into Wyoming, and then South Dakota, southwestern North Dakota.
Well, we talk about that. They had that, what did they call that? The Californians kept getting that fire hose weather last spring.
Right, that was the Pineapple Express, or whatever you want to call it, where the pipeline of moisture, that effectively ended the 3-year drought in the western United States last winter.
Yep, and that they're still dealing with some of that snowpack, I think, aren't they? In the Sierras and further west?
They're still dealing, they still have runoff from that, I think, except in the glacial areas, all the snow's finally gone, but hydrologically, California's in the best shape they've been in many, many years.
Yep. That include that Tulare Basin where that lake
right, so
reformed?
The lake that was once there, pumped dry by agriculture, has reformed, probably will last through this winter into spring of 2024, and especially if El Nino performs and they get another wet winter in central and southern California, it could last even longer.
Is that going to impact some of the produce that is grown in that area or not?
There are strawberries and some fruit and nut trees in that area. A lot of the things like strawberries comes from closer to the coast in the Salinas, Watsonville area. But there is an impact on cotton, as well as I mentioned, the orchards, the nut trees, all underwater. And in the case of those permanent crops, they'll need to be ripped out and replanted if and when it dries out.
Okay. Let's talk a little more about El Nino again then. typically that's a bigger impact on South America than it does on U.S. production, right?
Yeah, so you have to think El Nino, by definition, is a little strip of water in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean, and it warms up. And that little strip of ocean affects global weather patterns. The areas closer to South America are more influenced by El Nino than areas further away. That's why you don't see impacts in places like China and Europe, but you do in South America and, of course, the United States. South America, areas that have been suffering from drought recently, like Argentina and southern Brazil, they should turn wet. Now, you got to remember the calendar is opposite there. So, whereas we're heading into the fall, they're heading into spring. So, they're heading into the heart of their growing season very soon. So, we do expect a wetter weather pattern for Argentina and southern Brazil, key corn and soybean production areas.
I guess the bigger question is then how intense, how long is this El Nino going to last?
Likely it will be just a single year, unlike La Nina, which sometimes will last through 2 or occasionally 3 years. El Ninos seldom last more than a single year, but it is a pretty strong event. So that is worth noting that we have a moderate to strong El Nino that's already developed. It developed pretty early in the spring and summer and is going to affect weather patterns across the United States. Probably already contributed to the heat wave in the south. So here's the way to think about El Nino for this part of the world. There are 2 primary jet streams that affect the United States. There's a subtropical jet stream that cuts across the southern United States. There is also a polar jet stream that is more in charge of weather patterns here in the northern United States. During El Nino, what typically happens is the southern or the subtropical jet stream becomes very strong. That accounts for the wet weather that you tend to see from Southern California right across to the southern Atlantic. And so that should help places like Oklahoma and Texas come out of drought. It should keep at least Southern California wet for a second consecutive year. But in the north, the jet stream, the polar jet stream, tends to be very weak during El Nino. So the impact there is to make a mild and a rather dry winter, cold season. And that is true for Minnesota, for North Dakota. So as we head into, I think, October and beyond, I would expect to see, it doesn't mean it's going to be mild and dry every single day, but if you look at the broader, late fall to early spring, I would expect a mild, dry winter. All you folks with yardsticks out here from the Big Iron Farm Show, you may not need them to measure snow this winter. It should be a relatively low amount of snow for this winter. So that is something to be concerned with in areas that are still experiencing drought. Last year we got by on the snow. It helped to provide vital moisture in the spring. That may not happen this year. So we could come up short on snow, and by spring we could be short on moisture, especially in areas that are currently experiencing drought.
More of a climate question probably, but do you see that? Do you see us breaking this drought anytime soon?
It's kind of crazy because I think if you look at the context of drought across the northern plains and upper Midwest, we have actually seen quite a bit of drought in recent years. 2017, 2021, both very bad years, northern plains and into the far upper Midwest. The good news is that during the summertime, post El Nino, tends to be fairly wet, but we got to get through this winter first. So I think maybe a glass half full outlook here that we may go into spring short on moisture in a lot of areas, especially now experiencing drought. But as we go later into the summer of 2024, there may be some promise for drought relief. On a very, very broad scale, El Nino tends to be a U.S. drought breaker, whereas La Nina tends to be a drought maker. So we went through 3 years of La Nina, 2020 to early 2022. That coincided with a significant U.S. drought coverage that peaked at 63% in the fall of 2022. So again, maybe some pain in the short term, but I think by the summer of 2024, if the rains come in time, may be enough to salvage a pretty good season, at least fingers crossed perspective there.
Do we flip-flop then from El Nino to La Nina, or do we go through a neutral period like we did coming this way?
You know, that's a tough question because there's a barrier where you can't look beyond really like the spring of 2024. There's no way to know what the ocean and the atmosphere is going to do from that point forward. Now, I wrote down the last like 10 years worth of El Ninos and La Ninas, and there's been a pretty quick transition. You know, we had our 3-year La Nina, 2020 to early first month or two of 2023. Before that, our last El Nino was 2018-19. That coincided with all the flooding in 2019 and the wetness. So again, I think looking ahead to 2024, probably a 1-year El Nino. Will it be followed by La Nina? Question mark. That's a question I really can't answer.
Here in the North Dakota, NDSU in the state has put together the Mesonet that Minnesota is involved with a little bit as well. Is that important for some things that you do too, or do you not pay attention to those?
No, we love citizen science and observation networks as long as they are standardized. So anytime a state puts together an observation network, it's very valuable to us as agricultural watchers, and it's also valuable to the drought monitor folks. I would also encourage anybody who has ever heard of CoCoRaHS, which is a community collective rain and hail network. If you've ever heard of that, all you do is you put up a plastic rain gauge, 4-inch rain gauge, and put it on a fence post. Very valuable observations. And so, you know, if it's just a grassroots network, you report rainfall, no electronic equipment, one report once a day. Very valuable information for the drought monitor folks and for ag folks in general.
I could imagine the technology changes we've seen with computers, and that's impacted what you do big time.
Absolutely, but all of the computers in the world, there is one thing that seems to defy the advances, and that is rainfall measurement. So I encourage, most producers keep their own rain records. If you don't mind sharing those with the community, look up CoCoRaHS, CoCoRaHS, and we'd love to have observations from folks out in the field because that's huge for the drought monitor. It's huge for us at USDA just to kind of fill in the gaps in the observation network. But you're right. I mean, computers have changed everything over the last couple of generations. Yep. And
we're starting to see like more satellite imagery and that type of thing too.
Yeah, so you notice that USDA NASS is using more remote sensing in some of their crop production estimates now. So who would have thought that would have ever been done? But yeah, so you get a lot more satellite-based products. One thing that we lack in terms of observations is soil moisture measurements. And so we do have to rely on satellite, remotely sensed observations to kind of fill in the gaps to see soil moisture is very tough to measure.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the weekly crop progress reports that get put out. Do you have a role in that?
So USDA NASS puts out the crop progress reports. I'm not directly involved in that, but every Monday afternoon, about 4:10, I will talk to Gary Crawford at USDA Radio. He's been doing this for almost 50 years, since 1974. And he and I talk, and we put together a few short radio pieces that end up on the USDA radio newsline. Outlets like Red River Farm Network pick that up, Ag Day, all the heavy hitters. And so we get our voice out there. I'm not sure quite why it fell on me in the office of the chief economist to do crop progress, but nobody at NASS is willing to do it. So yep. I'm out there on the front lines every Monday afternoon talking with Gary.
We were talking about that earlier. I think about Gary. Christy Pettis worked there. Rod Bain is there now. I go back to Brenda Curtis days.
Yep, I remember Brenda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's been a long time.
Yeah.
Those crop progress reports, focus on any particular areas?
We try to look at the whole, again, like my job is the entire U.S., so we focus on the major crops, obviously, the corn, the soy, the wheat. We don't necessarily touch some of the minor crops on those week-to-week reports. But it's tough. I mean, you're trying to imagine talking about the entire U.S. corn crop in 1 minute. That's really what we're trying to do, and it's tough.
How do we interpret those numbers? Is it something that we need to be watching carefully?
I hear people all the time, it's like, don't pay any attention to the crop condition ratings. They don't mean anything, but I disagree. I think they do mean something. These reporters have been doing this a long time. I mean, there's a history there, and I think they are important. And I think if you look at the ultimate picture, I mean, there's gonna be years where you're good to excellence a little bit lower and your final production number is a little higher than you might expect. But there's still a message there, and I think it's important to look at those numbers every week.
With the wrap, probably more important is to watch what's happening around us as far as the local, maybe more the Mesonet or the local rainfall reports then.
Yeah, so of course, anytime we can get, here's one way to look at it, I guess, Randy, is that if we don't have these local reports, whether it's Mesonets or local observers, all we have are airport observations, because the Weather Service and the Federal Aviation Administration have a partnership to collect weather data at all the airport sites. It serves both interests because we get weather data and they get flight information. But that's not enough. I mean, there's only so many airports and they're not usually located in rural areas. So we depend on these Mesonets and our grassroots networks to collect data that actually shows us what's going on here in farm country. Otherwise, we're blind. We have satellite information. We might have computer modeled information, but we don't have actual observations without these networks.
Right. Was it a couple of years ago they were talking about because of the fewer flights, there was less weather data available?
Yeah, I mean, during COVID, we did have that. I mean, we still had automated networks, but some of the human observers, yeah, there's, and then you're right, the airplanes take measurements as they fly, so that's your upper air observations. That's what we were missing during COVID.
Talk about like your time at National Weather Service. They do the weather balloons and stuff like that. We see those flying once in a while. What are they collecting?
Yeah, so those from about 120, 130 different sites, major, mostly airport sites around the country, still at least twice a day, those weather balloons are going up. I know sometimes you might find them sitting in the field on your farms. There's an address, you can mail them back. They actually reuse the equipment if they get them back. Of course, on the East Coast, they all end up in the ocean, so we don't get those back. But when I lived in Wisconsin, I do remember seeing, I never found one, but I do remember seeing them fly through the air. So those collect upper air observations. So they leave the ground, they go up until the balloon reaches something like 80 or 90, 100,000 feet, the balloon explodes, and then they kind of parachute back to Earth at that point. But that collects data in the upper atmosphere all the way up to the upper reaches of the atmosphere, 200 millibars, which is 1/5 of our pressure that we have here. So the balloons really get big before they pop and explode. That goes into the computer models and it helps refine the forecasts. So that data, we have all these surface points, but you need that upper data too, because that's where your jet stream is, that's where where you see the smoke moving around and things like that, all those tracers. We need that upper data to simulate the atmosphere, because effectively what today's computer models are trying to do is model every molecule of air and water vapor and trying to determine where it's going to be in some future place. It's incredible that forecasters can do as well as they do out 7-10 days. And they're trying to push that even further, push the boundaries out beyond.
I was just going to ask, how accurate are those forecasts?
So the furthest computer models that actually try to simulate every molecule, they go out a couple of weeks or a little more. And you can tell the skill level really falls off after a couple of weeks. But I mean, amazingly good. We can look out 7 days now. When I first started, maybe 2 or 3 days. So it's that much of an improvement. Really important with things like hurricanes, where you're trying to figure out where Hurricane Lee's going to go. Is it going to hit Maine? Is it going to hit Atlantic Canada? That's the kind of thing that has really improved in 30 or 40 years.
We talked about the drought in that southern part of the U.S., up through the Midwest here. What's a hurricane do to that?
Well, I mean, there's some folks probably in Texas and Louisiana right now that would like to have a tropical storm, maybe not a full-fledged hurricane. We'd love to get some tropical moisture disorganized into that region. Right now, the way the atmosphere is, probably not going to happen. We did have Idalia come into Florida, and then very briefly we had the tropical storm move into Texas, but it had a real narrow swath and it didn't do a whole lot of good. So, yeah, I mean, that's always a double-edged sword with tropical moisture. You need the tropical moisture to keep the showers going, but you don't want to have a Category 3 or 4 hurricane.
Yep, exactly. Do those impact this far north at all?
The answer is rarely, but I would argue that you probably get more tropical moisture here from the Pacific than from the Atlantic, because usually things will recurve at the most through the heart of the Midwest and really not this far north. But with the whole monsoon circulation, that's all tropical moisture coming up. And we saw it this year. It all happened to rain out over Wyoming and South Dakota. But yeah, so you do see disorganized or monsoonal moisture every year, making it this far north ahead of cold fronts.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, I believe it was, we use World Weather Incorporated meteorologist Drew Lerner as our staff meteorologist.
Yep.
And he was talking about if we could pick up a typhoon or something that would happen to get up into Japan where the jet stream would catch it.
Yeah.
It would be probably more important for us.
Yeah, we've seen that. It seems like increasing. You know, ocean temperatures have been very warm recently. And so we've seen some typhoons pretty far north in the Pacific. And a few have hit Alaska. We had just a year or two ago, we had a really big storm hit Alaska. Sometimes those turn into non-tropical storms that make their way through the northern plains. So yeah, we can get Pacific moisture that way as well.
Speaking of that, typhoon, hurricane, what's the difference?
It's just nomenclature.
Okay.
So you draw the date line, 180 right there west of Hawaii. Everything to the east of that is a hurricane. Everything to the west is a typhoon.
Okay, so if something travels across it, it switches?
We have had changes where we've gone
Really?
from So I think it was 1994, Hurricane John became Typhoon John and then crossed back over and became a hurricane again.
Okay, interesting. Confusing if you're a forecaster.
Very confusing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Raining.
It's hard to hear yourself when
I know
you're...
it is. I know it is. As far as now, you don't handle South American weather at all. You have somebody else on staff that does that, looks at that.
Correct. Yeah, I do not personally handle South American weather. I do keep an eye on it because it does affect so much that goes on with trade in the U.S. and things like that. But again, we would be expecting as they move into their growing season this year, should be a more favorable, less droughty growing season for the corn and bean producers and wheat producers there.
Yeah. As far as tillable acres down there too, is that having an impact on the weather as if they're tearing more up? We always talked about that before in some of the climatological studies.
Yeah, I mean, to make more acres there, they have to push into the rainforest. So that may be changing the climate there. It's been such a dramatic land use change that we're probably going to see repercussions to that for some time.
Talk a little bit about then the Midwest crop area here. Eastern side's seen plenty of moisture. Western side's been dry until recently. Now we're starting to see some rain in that winter wheat area.
Right. So it's been interesting. We're coming off a period where we had basically 3 years of drought in the western half of the United States. And so we kind of broke that a little bit, but now we've seen obviously shifting drought patterns. Now we've got drought that's kind of moved into the western corn belt, and we've kind of left some areas in between free of drought. So we're sort of in flux right now, it seems like, from a drought perspective. Again, El Nino going into the winter, we do expect that mild, dry northern U.S. and a wetter southern United States. So I think we'll continue to see a shifting drought pattern as we move through the next few months.
The last few years, up until, maybe 2 years ago, we had never heard the word derecho before. We've always had them, or is this something that's a new phenomenon?
No, it's always been around, but we've had a couple of derechos on steroids the last say, decade. We had a big one in 2012, late June, that barreled its way all the way from the Midwest, I think Iowa to Virginia, basically. Then, of course, in 2020, we had the epic, first time we had a derecho hit the billion-dollar disaster list, and it was way above it. It was like $10+ billion. But, I mean, it just tore Iowa up. And the time of year, we were just talking about this before we came up here, that, you know, it's been unusual timing for thunderstorms. To see something blow through like that 2021 in August, I think it was August 10th, that's terrible timing for crops because they're too big to withstand. We did have another derecho this year, but it hit early enough that crops were very small and the damage was far less. So it's all in timing. And the media has a role in this because they popularize terms. You see polar vortex, or you see, you know, derecho, and just, you know, even we talked about Pineapple Express or whatever you want to call it. So these terms, they're catchy, they're catchphrases, they're good taglines, they make good headlines, they're clickbait. And so, you know, they've always been around, but when they hit farm country at the wrong time, it's big news and it's a big loss.
Speaking of that, the clickbait part of it, is that changed weather forecasting?
It has, because you have to keep the interest. There's so much competition on social media and websites. People are getting their news now. Not as much, maybe not true for the older generations, but, you know, less TV, and it's more you're on your phone or on your computer and looking at stuff. So that has changed the way we consume the news and also how it's distributed as well.
Anybody have any questions for Brad?
I have a question back here.
Yeah.
So you mentioned technology really changing, and especially in satellite during your time here. How has technology changed in terms of accuracy and predictability in the time you've worked as a meteorologist?
Yeah, I think I hinted at that when I was answering his question, and that is we've effectively doubled our period of accuracy. So what used to be a good forecast out 3 or 4 days is now 6 or 8 days. So that's what supercomputers have done. You know, you got to remember that until about 50 years ago, we didn't even have satellite imagery. So in terms of things like tracking hurricanes or cold fronts or weather systems, we had nothing 50 years ago. It was very rudimentary satellite, if at all. So it's been an incredible, the advent of supercomputers and satellites has been a huge game changer the last 2 generations for weather forecasting.
Long-term weather outlooks. I was told one time that it takes 30 to 40 days for the atmosphere to circle the globe, and so you really can't feasibly predict any longer out than that. Is that true?
Yes and no. So we do tend to see, when we see atmospheric blocking, which we've seen, I would say, more of than we used to because of changing, you know, I know it's a bad word to say this, but changing climate. You know, we are in a warmer, wetter climate here than we used to be, say, 60 years ago, 50, 40 years ago. And that has, you know, I forgot where I was going with that. What was your original question?
I was thinking about how...
Oh, yeah. So with blocking patterns, they tend to lock in for periods of 4 to 6 weeks. And so if you get a good solid block established, that can be a pretty good predictor out a month or 2. But when you get beyond that, your best forecaster is El Nino and La Nina. That can take you out maybe a year. And so that's really, when the forecasters at the National Weather Service are issuing these 1 and 3 month and seasonal outlooks, that's the kind of things they're looking at. They're pinning all their hopes on El Nino or La Nina. If something else comes in and picks up the weight, like a block, it can throw that forecast totally out. So when we're talking about a mild, dry winter, that's what we expect. It's because of El Nino. If something happens that usually happens, I would say, in this part of the country about 3/4 of the time. But there's a 1/4 chance that forecast could go out the window. Something else could happen. A block could form that could throw that totally out.
The train of thought just went away.
Yeah, that's 2 of us now.
I know what I was going to ask. The weather forecast models get to be I almost seem like a tendency to maybe rely too much on the computers and not on your experience. Or is that a problem? Or is that an issue?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, people put a little bit too much reliance on the computers, especially people that have been doing this 30, 40, 50 years. They've got a lot of life experience. It's kind of like farming. Sometimes you don't throw out the old tried and true. So that is very true.
Sure. Any other questions from the audience here? We're getting ready to start wrapping things up here with Brad. Here's a chance to ask USDA meteorologists some questions. All right, any other final thoughts here, Brad, as we wrap things up?
Well, I hope everything works out for harvest, and I hope the drought does not get too bad for you folks next spring. We'll hope for the El Nino to come through with some summer rains in time to give you a good 2024.
I guess one thing I want to just kind of touch on, maybe a typical day. What do you do at USDA in your role as a meteorologist?
It depends on the day because I've got different responsibilities, but Monday and Tuesday largely devoted to weekly weather and crop bulletin plus USDA radio interviews. On the 6 or 7 times a year when I am on Drought Monitor, that is all consuming. I have to put everything else pretty much aside. That is an all-week project with working on the Drought Monitor, trying to draw those drought lines.
Okay. Those, speaking of that drought map, we had a new one out this morning. I haven't seen it yet, and you hadn't either, you said. So.
I barely took a glance at it, yeah.
Exactly. That is done week by week.
That is done every week by a rotating team of 10 authors.
Okay.
Yep.
Any other final questions for Brad?
I have a question here. So when you think about all the tools that are available for farmers to utilize in terms of weather, air temperature, soil temperature, all that stuff, where can they find the best, most important tools to help them?
Well, I would definitely encourage everybody to keep their eye on the Drought Monitor every week if you don't. And I know it's not designed specifically for agriculture. We try to do long and short-term drought all on a single snapshot map, but Drought Monitor is a good resource. Also, encourage you, not only do we do the weekly weather and crop bulletin out of our office of the chief economist, but I do a daily update, just a real simple daily U.S. update on agricultural weather. You can find that if you go to USDA, Office of the Chief Economist. It's pretty easy to find publications there.
All right, as we wrap up then, the quick final, going into fall, a little bit wetter, October maybe, or a little bit, but drier, warmer winter.
Yeah, so, I mean, real quick here, just after today's rain, beautiful weather for a week, then transitioning into a mild stormy pattern for the rest of September, probably into October. Then at some point, probably kicking into a mild, dry, mid to late autumn.
All right, very good. USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey, let's give him a hand.